And we're back in the studio with new gear like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Monday evening, chilly and windy evening here with me in New York. And once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So today is going to be another in the continuing series, which seems to be picking up steam, of the best movie you've never seen. Today's film is now almost 45 years old. It's the film debut for an actor who would go on to not only win an Academy Award, but in his later years also play a pretty significant role in the MCU, has some great scenes opposite Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark / Iron Man. And he was an actor who sadly wasn't very old when he passed. I think he died in 2021. He was 72, I believe. But he was somebody who was well respected within the movie business as somebody who was, even if he could be a little kind of prickly occasionally, as Jeff Daniels jokingly recalled in the Christopher Reeve documentary, the three men were friends before they hit the big time. Jeff Daniels, Christopher Reeve, and this gentleman. But he was somebody who was he was held in high esteem. And I've talked about him on the channel. He gave incredibly, ridiculously, surprisingly, given the fact that he'd already won an Oscar, underrated performance in a film from the early 90s where he plays a physician who gets a taste of his own medicine when he develops cancer. The actor is Oscar winner for 1985's Kiss of the Spider Woman, William Hurt. The movie that you've probably never seen, especially if you're under 40, is Ken Russell's 1980 classic, Altered States. Now, there are certain movies in history which, even if they weren't good, quote unquote, are notable because they were pioneering, trailblazing, groundbreaking in some way or another. I recently on the channel discussed the filmmaker James Whale, who did the original Frankenstein from 1931 and Bride of Frankenstein, and the movie I discussed for this particular series of the best movie you've never seen, The Old Dark House. Now, James Whale's friend and fellow filmmaker who worked at Universal, Todd Browning, is credited with the kind of first modern, if you believe that 1931 is modern, but the first modern sound version of Dracula in 1931. For whatever that's worth. And as I talked about, Browning, I don't know what happened, but after an incredible first 15 to 20 minutes to film, it's not that it goes off the rails, it's just not as interesting. Ken Russell's Altered States, which was William Hurt's film debut, he plays a brilliant Ivy League researcher named Eddie Jessup. It is the first large-scale Hollywood film to use what is commonly called CGI. They didn't call it, I don't think they specifically used that phrase, and I don't think they said green screen in 1980, but this is the first movie to combine what we call practical effects with computer graphics. And if you go into the movie knowing what I just said, the effect is thrilling because you're seeing a very talented filmmaker, in the case of Ken Russell, and an actor who was still finding his way, but had a very natural feel in front of the camera. William Hurt was somebody who just looked like he belonged on screen. And it's ironic that he had success on the stage before and after this particular film, which catapulted him to movie, not quite superstardom. William Hurt was never somebody whose name could open a film, but somebody who headlined a number of major Hollywood films for just about a decade. And somebody who took full advantage of the fact that this movie made a splash, even though it is a bit of, it's a movie that some people just don't like, because it has very serious, heavy science fiction elements. And there is a lot of what I would call real egghead, elitist kind of discussion in this. And the reason why I'm comfortable saying that phrase, using the phrase egghead, using the phrase elitist, is because I was a kid who had it real easy and was sitting in film school debating a lot of, I can be honest, a lot of gobbledygook, while people around me in my age bracket were already busting their tails in the workaday world. Well, in the world of this movie, Eddie Jessup, in the late 1960s, when he presumably is still an undergraduate, he begins doing these weird, well, they're weird to me. He does these strange experiments where he immerses himself in a sensory deprivation tank. Now, we've seen things like this. When I lived in Huntington, I was a block and a half away from a place called Lift, which specializes in weightless floats, where you basically go into a chamber filled with water, and it's completely dark. And you could have a little Enya-style music if you so prefer. You could have psychedelic lights if you want to maybe turn it into something like what Eddie Jessup does in this movie. But the idea basically is that if done properly, you might start to hallucinate. You might reach a higher state of consciousness. So in the world of the late 1960s, Eddie Jessup feels like he's closing in on a breakthrough. He's trying to find out if there is a way to tap into different stages of human evolution. This is all very 180 IQ. This is Einstein, Curie, Stanley Kubrick level of thinking. And so we pick up the story in the New York City of the present day. And Eddie Jessup is, I think, working as a professor. I don't know if he teaches at Columbia. I'm pretty sure it's not NYU or Fordham. But he seems like he's doing okay in life. And he's married to a terrific actress who had a lot of success on TV named Blair Brown. And they appear to be happily married, but he's not happy. He loves her, but he is so obsessed with the research that he kind of left on the table in his younger days that he needs to, in the immortal words of Jeff Goldblum in The Fly, he needs to dive headfirst into the plasma spring. See what I'm saying? As Jeff famously points out in that movie. So he goes on this kind of bizarre sabbatical where he meets a lot of indigenous peoples who give him, oddly enough, a boost, a push in the right direction of what he's really looking for. He doesn't just want to sit in an immersion tank again and hallucinate. He believes there is a way to tap into our past selves. He doesn't mean reincarnation, but he believes that human beings used to look different, act different, be different. It's not really much of a stretch. We just don't know how far back you have to go to get the Neanderthal man, but he wants to see, is this possible? He's willing to give his life in the name of science. And we're not really sure, is this just one big ego trip? Is this a very large-scale act of him basically jerking himself off, so to speak? Or is he maybe onto something? The film goes down these very intellectual avenues. There are conversations that Eddie Jessup has, for example, with some of his cohorts, his friends, and also scientists, in terrific actor Bob Balaban and another guy, Charles Haig. And they have the kinds of conversations that you don't see in a major studio film. Forget 2024. You didn't even see conversations like this by the end of the 1980s. It wasn't happening anymore. Because audiences, they're just going to check out. Unless they're also scientists, and then they're probably throwing tomatoes at the screen saying, this is ridiculous. He begins to take these very serious hallucinogenic drugs while he is in, well, he doesn't take them while he's in. He takes them, then he goes into the sensory deprivation isolation tank. And he starts to have physical reactions to the drugs, to the tank. The combination of this, he begins to manifest physical changes. And he says something after coming out of the tank at one point, and he has his friends there. I don't remember the names of the characters. Bob Balaban, very, very solid actor. He had success on TV as well. And Charles Haig, kind of an overwrought, sort of a yeller sort of an actor. His face is always red. He's always getting angry. But Eddie Jessup comes out of the sensory deprivation tank. And he says something about, he says he can't speak. So get the fuck out of here. What the hell? What do you mean you can't speak? And he writes something out about, I need you to take a circumference of my jaw, of my mouth, before I reconstitute. Now I hear the word reconstitute. I think about reconstituted lemon juice that my mother used to buy in the supermarket. What do you mean reconstitute? What is he talking about? Well, what he's talking about is he came out of the tank and the circumference of his teeth, his dental work, his jaw is different. It is larger. Now, I don't need to tell you that that's impossible by what we understand about what can happen if you or I go into a sensory deprivation tank. We might hallucinate, we might get scared, we might have lucid dreams, waking nightmares. But I got to tell you, when I come out of that tank, my bite radius is going to be exactly the same. Take that to the bank. It's going to be the same. So he starts experiencing strange occurrences when he is not in the tank, when he is not taking these hallucinogenic drugs and then going into the tank. And we start getting into the special effects territory where he is not exactly changing into something else, but he is fulfilling the goal of his experiment, which is that he appears to be regressing. And there are segments of this movie, it came out a little bit before, about 8-9 months before, I think, where the film almost feels like, if you've seen American Werewolf in London, it appears to be going into that arena. And everybody around Eddie is convinced, first they were convinced he was crazy, and now it's like Arnold Schwarzenegger in Last Action Hero, I'm not worried that you're crazy, I'm worried that you're right. And people begin to fear for Eddie Jessup's life because these manifestations are starting to take over, where he is simply at home, not taking any more drugs, not in a tank, and his arm begins to morph a little bit like David Naughton in American Werewolf in London. This does not, mild spoiler, this is not a horror film. This is a movie that has a few moments of what you would call horror film elements, but it is not a horror film. This is pure, idea-driven science fiction the whole way through. And I remember, before I saw the movie, this is another one of those movies, and I talk about this kind of concept a lot, but you understand, I'm right in the middle of what is known as Generation X. And when I was a young, impressionable movie fan who maybe hadn't seen, forget Pulp Fiction, I was already an adult, but a number of these movies until I happened to read about them. My first exposure to even learning that there was a film called Altered States came way before the internet. In about 1989, I was 15, and I bought one of Roger Ebert's books, which was just called Movie Home Companion. Now, it was nothing more than a collection of print reviews that Ebert had filed in the Chicago Sun-Times going back about 15 to 20 years from during the days when he won the Pulitzer Prize, which I think he won in the late 60s, early 70s. I'm not sure on that. I know that he won the Pulitzer in the 70s, though, and that kind of how he ended up on TV. Pulitzer Prize winning film critic sounds really good. But there are certain movies that I hadn't heard of, that I only learned of through Roger Ebert's Movie Home Companion, reading it in 1989. And a film that Ebert talked about and talked up as being a very high quality piece of work was Ken Russell's Altered States. And the way Roger described the movie, it made me want to see it because he kind of described it like it was a horror film. And I was a kid who was interested in horror, but if you read the review and you could go on to the internet, Roger Ebert, all of his reviews going back to the 60s, almost 100% of them are in print form at the Chicago Sun-Times website. You can find it anywhere. But Ebert, it doesn't say that it's a horror film. He says this is a film of ideas. This is a film of ideas. And William Hurt, more or less, he says, this is an exciting new talent. He has a different way of reading his lines. And this is why William Hurt was an actor that some people just never got how he became such a major player. Now, when he got older, in his older era, and I was referring, he played General Ross in the MCU before Harrison Ford, unfortunately, had to take over for him when he passed. But William Hurt, in his later era, he was more of a straightforward actor who would rely, I hate to say it, on the fact that people like me knew who he was, and we were always excited to see him when he popped up in films, like from the 2000s forward, even in small roles like the father of Into the Wild, where Emil Hirsch played the real, I don't remember the guy, he disappeared in the Alaskan wilderness, and William Hurt played the father, who basically was a guy with 200 IQ. It might as well have been Eddie Jessup all grown up. But this movie plays fair with its audience. There are no narrative cheats. There is no where the guy is fine and then all of a sudden he looks like Ape Man. we see him start to, if you want to use the word regress, but we see him start to regress. We see the manifestations. They start slowly. And it appears that the experiment is controllable, but it wouldn't be much of a movie if this was simply the village of the nice, happy people. I'm going to do some research, and then we're just going to tie a nice bow on it and have a cake afterwards. No, the movie gets into very serious territory. Is Eddie Jessup going to be okay? Is the end nigh? And we get some of this really crazy imagery that really, it wasn't done at the time. Nowadays with CGI, the way that it is now, you wouldn't be doing this kind of film in the manner that they did it here. But there is some batshit crazy images in this film that will stay with you, like a kind of satanic looking horse with 12 eyes, just really weird stuff. And this is not so much world building sci-fi, but this is what I would call consciousness building, where you might actually start to see the world a little bit differently. Not because you're going to do the experiments of Eddie Jessup and the unusual idea in the world of the film that when he started, he's the subject. He's not doing an experiment to try to change the world using someone else as a guinea pig. He's the guinea pig. And that's another reason, an area where this movie is different. He's experimenting on himself. He doesn't want anybody else. It's not a matter of being altruistic and saying, well, I don't want anyone to get hurt. He doesn't want anybody to experience it but himself. He wants to be the first person to go through whatever it is that he is going to go through. Now, William Hurt moved from this movie, and I believe his next film is Lawrence Kasdan's Body Heat, which I would argue is probably the best movie that he was ever in his career. It's a top 3 all-time film noir, a great mystery, and a terrific slow burn kind of erotic thriller before those became in vogue in the early 90s, where you even had Madonna in Body of Evidence. Not a good movie. Not a good movie. Basic Instinct, huge hit in the same kind of Body Heat realm. Not as good. And Final Analysis with Richard Gere and Kim Basinger and Uma Thurman, also not good. There were a lot of those erotic thrillers. Consenting Adults with Kevin Kline, Kevin Spacey, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio. Another movie in that same erotic thriller where you have major Hollywood players, in some cases getting naked, or as Michael Douglas points out in Basic Instinct, well, what are you going to do, Nick? Fuck like minks, raise rugrats, live happily ever after. Yeah, good luck. Good luck. But Altered States is pure sci-fi. And it is a movie that is challenging. This is another film, and I've used this phrase before, but it applies here as well. This is not a movie that you can be a passive observer. Well, you can, but if you're a passive observer, you're going to miss a lot. And it's not going to land for you what he's doing and how he's able to do it. Because the reason why the experiments didn't really go anywhere in the 60s is because he wasn't taking the psychotropic mushrooms, hallucinogenic drugs. He wasn't able to tap into what he was trying to do. Like, he had the right idea, but he didn't have the proper accoutrements to pull it off. And then as we meet him in the early 1980s, he does. And now let's just see what happens here. Let's see how far we can take this. And you get the idea that Eddie Jessup is so motivated and so focused on where he wants to go and his goals. It's almost that he doesn't care if it kills him. This is where he wants to go. This is his life. His life is research. His life is about learning new things, about broadening minds, broadening horizons. If he can survive and live to tell the tale, so much the better. Now, it's also true that as the first large-scale Hollywood production to have what is commonly now called CGI, to have a lot of computer work mixed in with the practical effects that I've mentioned, some of the trick shots. I mean, Ken Russell pulls off a lot of cool camera moves and inserts and stuff like that. There is something to be said for movies that try. And there's a version of this where Ken Russell only used practical effects, because sometimes we've seen it. If the technology is not quite there, it doesn't look right. And yeah, the scenes show. There are certain shots of William Hurt, or what's supposed to be William Hurt, where you might actually giggle, but there are enough that hit the mark where you say, I'm glad that they went for it because somebody had to be first. And this movie took a lot of risks in the storytelling style, in the just over the top, hitting you over the head with how smart everyone in the story is. I mean, us normal IQ type people, can we really follow what they're talking about? I mean, I kind of had an idea, but you can't really passively watch this film. At least in the early stages, you can't, because it is important. Once you get to the present day where he resumes the experiments, well, then it's a little bit different. It's not like you're going to, oh my God, I missed something, I went to the bathroom. No, you can follow it. And in broad strokes, the movie is not difficult to understand. It's just when you ask yourself, how is this happening? Why is this happening? That's why there have to be stretches of the film where you are engaged and you're paying attention. Now, Roger Ebert gave the movie 3.5 stars. I don't know that he, even up to that point in time, if he put it with his, favorite science fiction films, but he said, you have to see this movie if you're interested in sci-fi. And he liked the kind of pioneering aspect and all that. He loved William Hurt's performance. And Blair Brown was an actress also who had a very kind of, I don't want to say old school, but she had a very earthy quality to her, meaning she comes across like a real person, not just a performer reading lines. I feel the connection between her and William Hurt more from her to him, but I feel like that was intentional. I don't think that was coincidental, because the character of Eddie Jessup is presented as somebody who pretty much only relies on himself and maybe thinks he only needs himself. And the movie then gets into a bit of what you might call cliche territory, where maybe it's the love that he actually has for his wife. Maybe that's the only thing that can bring him back to the 1 + 1 = 2, the diegetic present, the real world of living to tell the tale, and maybe being grateful for the experience, but also happy that you didn't die, because you could die a horrible death if you're not careful. And there are certain kinds of movies in this ballpark where a love conquers all. Even if the love conquers all is hinted at, it's going to be mawkish and stupid. It works in this film. And that is a key part of that, is because Blair Brown hits her marks beautifully. It's really unfortunate she didn't have a bigger movie career, because I think she's really, really good in this film. Now, sometimes, as you know, I look up to see what movies are on which platforms. And I'm sorry to say that I did not specifically Google Altered States. I know that this movie was on Max at a certain point in time. I don't think that it's ever been on Netflix, at least not to my knowledge. But if it's not, and you could certainly Google, it could be on Tubi or Pluto or that free app called Canopy, or maybe even Fandango free or Freevee. But at worst, I know that it's on Amazon Prime. At least here it's $2. And if it's on Amazon Prime, it's probably on Apple Plus. If you're interested in seeing something that you have for sure never seen before, you watch this movie, and even if the mechanics of when it threatens to turn into a monster movie, even if that kind of doesn't quite make it for you, you're going to see something unlike anything you have seen before. And then if you have any interest in history, you say to yourself, this is the first movie that did this. And that William Hurt, very interesting looking actor. The way that he reads his lines is interesting, because sometimes he reads his lines like a stage performer, but other times he reads it like, no, this is a film actor. And there is a difference, because there are certain people who never starred in a play. In the same way that Pauline Kael used to say about Steven Spielberg, one of the reasons why she found his work so incredibly exciting, I doubt that Steven has ever seen a stage play. He thinks only in terms of motion pictures. There are moments where William Hurt's performance has a certain level of theatricality to it, but then other times it's pure, strong film acting. And he didn't accidentally luck into the incredible career that he had. And as I said, I'm sorry he's gone, because as strong as he was in the MCU, the sequences, for example, in Civil War, where he, with a straight face, he's not backing down from any of these Avengers who he knows could crack a button like a twig, could end his life like a twig. No, he's going to say his piece. You guys want to go right ahead. I'm right here. You know that I'm just human. He has some really amazing scenes as General Ross. Well, see how Harrison Ford makes out. And I think Ford's going to be terrific, because he's Harrison Ford. Whatever he's good at, whatever he does, he's good at. But Altered States from 1980, directed by Ken Russell, a groundbreaking, pioneering, fascinating, thought-heavy science fiction film. The newest entry in our continuing series of the best movie you've never seen. This has been episode 401 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Monday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.